I realized that, as I drove down the long dirt road to the Reed farm once again, something different was burning in my chest. It wasn't just the crispness of the golden autumn horizon, or the sweet smell of fresh hay reaching me. My annual return to that part of the world wasn't just about revisiting old habits or helping with the harvest. It was a silent search for answers that the city never gave me. My name is Simon Carter. At 33, I carry the residue of two worlds: the irredeemable pragmatism of the civil engineer I became in Chicago, and the quiet resignation of someone who grew up within the rigidity of the Amish. The son of parents who would never understand the contradictions in my eyes. When I came back every September, I wasn't just chasing my roots. I was chasing myself. If you like what you read, please subscribe to the channel and hit the like button for more stories like this. My face carried the marks of time, of heavy summers planting corn and winters I spent far away, trying to be someone else in the modern world. My hair, darkened by dust, and my hands, already calloused from the hardened concrete of my job, also carried dense memories that had accumulated like layers of hay in a forgotten barn. For years, I gave up the farm routine for promises of freedom, but the simplicity of that place never stopped fascinating me. The first morning found me sitting on the Reed's porch step, even before the sun had risen through the fog, breathing in the deep mix of aromas of that life: wet earth, cured wood, soft spices from the kitchen, all of it cradling me like a quiet lap. Life there had its own rhythm. The clock obeyed the seasons, not the outside world. I woke up with the orange light, heard the snapping of branches and the lowing of oxen demanding food even before the birds had started their day. August Reed, my most intimate reason for returning, always came running out from the back of the house, his grown-up silhouette marked by the same smile he had when we were boys. He had inherited the mission of running the family farm, a mix of responsibility and pride, but also an invisible weight. Soon the smell of warm bread would fill everything, and it was time to join everyone at the kitchen table, listening to Mrs. Reed talk about pruning, neighbors, and, discreetly, ask how life was in the city. My connection with August marked every moment. The day unfolded in a kind of choreography of arms and glances, both of us busy with the mundane, picking corn ears, reinforcing the fence, rounding up the horses. But the shared silences held so much more than words. He was never one for speeches. He was one of those who spoke through their actions. His quiet, almost always silent way both bothered and attracted me with equal force. I'd watch August as he chopped wood, his face tense and his fists tight, his skin golden from the sun. Sometimes I'd catch him looking at me too, and then he'd quickly look away to ruminate on the roof, as if he were hiding secrets bigger than the farm itself. On the third day, everything changed. I usually followed the routine, but a strange noise at the back fence made me cut through the cornfield. There was August, alone, kneeling in front of a forgotten hoe with a distant expression. Time seemed to compress as I approached. Our memories rose to the surface like dust lifted by the wind. "Need a hand?" I asked. He looked up and smiled briefly. "If you want." There was no ceremony between us. It was as if our closeness had never gone away. We started fixing the fence together. Our dirt-stained hands touched more than once, the conversation floating between small talk and silences full of what wasn't being said. The air grew heavier with his presence, and I felt myself being pulled into something indefinable, still without a name. What you're hearing here is just the beginning. The complete unfiltered stories with all the details you can imagine are available now. See the link in the description right now. August was different from what I remembered. More mature, and at the same time more insecure. An extra wrinkle around his eyes, but also a spark that hadn't been there before. The two of us, now adults, shared similarities that built bridges and differences that marked abysses. The day trickled by, each break in our interactions filled with internal questions we never verbalized. The mess of the city felt distant, and here, in that repetitive work, and in those moments where our hands crossed paths, we began to form something new. The farm was the stage for a silent story, full of veiled provocations since the days of playing hide-and-seek in the barn loft. After lunch, August and I went to get some old tools from a shed at the back of the property. It was a simple scene. The smell of old oil, wooden shelves filled with hardware, and enough dust to cover any doubt. I helped separate parts, and he told me about small repairs. And there, between shy laughs and long glances, I realized the distance of the years had dissolved into a kind of effortless camaraderie. We began to share more than just tasks. We shared memories, impressions from our youth, comments about the unpredictable future. Each conversation carried a new tension, an unspoken promise that our paths were only just beginning to intertwine again. At the end of that afternoon, I suggested we walk to the old creek behind the field. We walked in silence, hearing only the rustling of the weeds and the creak of my boot on the damp ground. August talked about the need for replanting, about the suffocating routine of the farm, and I confessed the exhaustion of city life. In this honest exchange, we grew together once more. The setting sun drew our long shadows, and out of the corner of my eye, I looked for signs that there was much more there than just nostalgia. He told me about his family's pressure for him to get married, the frustrating attempts to please expectations that never made sense to him. I listened, feeling every word echoing in me like a kind of collective confession, something we both seemed to need to hear and to say. Many moments between us found their place in that slow rhythm, as if the world were conspiring to prolong every instant. August always saved the last piece of dinner for me, brought fresh juice during our work breaks, and showed me little gadgets he'd built on his own. In return, I'd share details of the renovations I was doing in Chicago, showing him photos on my phone of buildings with lake views. Our interests crossed between the technical and the sensitive, and each story we shared added a brick to the construction of a renewed friendship full of sparks. In the middle of these daily activities, I couldn't help but notice the obstacles around us. It wasn't just the community's expectations. There was an invisible wall filled with doubts, fears, and emotional barriers that came from within. Mrs. Reed would hover, curious and silent, her sharp questions as a worried mother filtering every word we exchanged. A tension hung over everything, as if the place were walking on the edge of a secret. August spoke less and less about his family's plans, and he'd hesitate when mentioning meetings with neighbors or details about the future they expected of him. I, in turn, floated between the desire to stay and the guilt of no longer belonging to that world, recognizing that I carried ghosts with me that I didn't know how to face. The harvest brought many tests, unexpected storms, disobedient animals, machines that broke down when you least expected it. These external obstacles demanded our joint effort. We overcame difficulties with creativity, and, every now and then, a nervous laugh. But it was inside us that the real conflict became unbearable. More than once I found August alone, staring at the horizon as if searching for answers. And each time, I knew I was there, beside him, also searching for some redemption. At night, I'd often sit on the porch and analyze everything that had happened. The challenges of the harvest seemed small compared to the restlessness inside me. August's eyes, sometimes lost, sometimes intense, made me reflect on my choices, on never having named certain feelings. In those shared silences, the question pounded in my head. How far would we go with this camaraderie, and what would happen if we crossed the barriers we never dared to break? The fourth day dawned with a different feel. The air was warmer, promising a muggy night. At breakfast, Mrs. Reed mentioned preparing for an autumn party, suggesting that August should invite someone special. The comment landed like a hammer blow on our discreet routine, and I saw August look away, press his lips together, and bury his face in the bread in front of him. I went to work with even more focus that day, using physical exhaustion to distract myself from my own thoughts. I'd already noticed that August, despite all his sense of responsibility, carried a weight on his shoulders that had nothing to do with work. And inside me, the recognition that there was something bigger between us was beginning to break the silence, begging to be seen. Away from his family's eyes, our conversations became deeper. We talked about loneliness, about failures, about the fear of getting old without understanding yourself. Between each sentence, there was a silent hope that maybe there was a way out, a path to belonging. When I sat alone in the barn at the end of the workday, I saw August approach, carrying 2 bottles of homemade cider. He sat beside me and we just stayed there, listening to the chirping of insects and the distant sound of a hammer. "Do you think some people just don't fit into other people's expectations?" he asked, looking at me sideways. I looked for an answer in the shadows of the barn and mumbled something about freedom, about the weight of escapes and choices. The conversation wasn't long, but the intensity of that moment stayed with me like the acrid smell of dry hay, impossible to ignore, impossible to name. I knew, with every fiber of my being, that we were about to cross a line. The obstacles, internal or external, had clarified the real question. It wasn't about the harvest, or about working the land. It was about what a man could or couldn't be within the limits he'd been taught. August, even without ever saying the word gay, made it clear that there was a universe of doubts and realizations within him. And I, by his side, felt the urgency to live something that went beyond the invisible walls of that community. I didn't know the name of the feeling, but I knew that this night would be the beginning of the answers that I had always been missing. Nothing in the world could have prepared me for the tension that grew inside me as twilight set in on that fifth night. The suffocating late September heat seemed to want to force us into the barn, where the breeze was less harsh. I was trying to finish simple tasks, but my thoughts were circling around the last conversation I'd had with August. The sky was slowly darkening, painting the field with a palette of orange and blue. The forecast for a stuffy night gave me the perfect excuse to suggest we go up to the loft together to get the old fans, a practical detail to help with the temperature, but also the only excuse I could think of to be alone. I crossed the yard in my boots, my hands sweaty not from the heat, but from nervousness, feeling August's gaze follow me. We went up the wooden ladder of the barn together, and on each rung, a detail from our childhood came to life. The swallow's nest on the beam, the smell of old paint from our first teenage urges to create a world of our own in that refuge. Up there, the moonlight came through the cracks, drawing pale lines on the hay that seemed like secrets waiting to be revealed. The atmosphere had something sacred about it, almost like a temple where memories, fears, and desires were kept. We started going through the boxes in silence. The dry hay rustled under our feet. I said a few words about tools, but the subject quickly died. There was nothing I wanted to say except what needed to be felt. I felt August's eyes on me, watching my every move, and when we finally stood side by side, for a moment it was impossible to decide where to look. Everything in my body was screaming for closeness. He asked me, almost in a whisper, why I always came back. I was silent, staring at the floor, searching for courage in my memories. I don't know if I can answer that, I confessed. It wasn't enough to say it was nostalgia for my childhood, for the smell of bread coming out of the oven, for the sound of the wagon wheels. It was him. It always was. The words were insufficient, almost ridiculous in the face of the power of that moment. But I tried. There's something here that doesn't exist anywhere else. I felt his breathing quicken, heard his clothes shift with a nervous movement. For a second, August stood still, but he didn't look away. He finally raised his face, and I saw a plea for permission in his eyes, as if he were tired of carrying everything on his own. Then, as if an invisible thread connected us, our shoulders brushed against each other casually. The sweet smell of his sweat mixed with the scent of the hay, awakening memories of past summers, of afternoons when we'd play hide-and-seek there, long before we knew what the words meant. Time seemed suspended. We were trapped in the space between desire and doubt. I lightly touched his arm, and August didn't pull back. On the contrary, he leaned in even more, as if he wanted to confirm what was in that touch. I glanced at his lips, and when our eyes met once again, there was no way to pretend that this was just friendship. The silence turned into pure electricity. I leaned in slightly, hesitating, letting the space between us get smaller and smaller, guided more by intuition than certainty. The first kiss came without warning, etched on the line between fear and longing. His lips touching mine were a shock, an outpouring of everything we'd spent so much time suffocating. Shy, tense at first, then more intense, more decisive, as if we were both, finally, coming to our senses. The touch seemed like an answer to questions we didn't even know how to ask. Our hands found their way to each other, fingers exploring backs, arms, necks, with the delicacy of someone rediscovering and at the same time, with the urgency of someone who has always known. With every gesture, an internal barrier crumbled. The smell of the hay, the heat of the loft, the muffled whispers, everything merged into a feeling of desperate freedom. It was as if for all those years we had been trying to decipher a code, and suddenly the solution was right there, within reach of a touch. He whispered my name, his voice hoarse, loaded with so much that couldn't fit into sentences. He pulled me closer, and there, among those familiar piles of hay, our bodies could finally speak in the silent language of skin and desire. I wasn't sure how to act, where to put my hands, but his every move guided me unhurriedly, with surrender. It was as if together we were long separated pieces, finally fitting together. The hay pricked my arm, but even that didn't seem to matter. All that mattered was the warmth of his body against mine. Our eyes closed, suggesting that the whole world could wait. We explored our limits, sometimes with urgency, sometimes with a reverent calm, like someone who knows they are witnessing their own truth. There was a moment when August pulled back for a half-second, looked me in the eyes, and said softly, "I didn't know what it felt like to feel this way." There was surprise, confession, but also an unprecedented peace in that look. I smiled, unable to hide the mix of joy and relief. I didn't say much, but I think my expression was enough of a response. In that instant, the doubts seemed irrelevant. Labels didn't matter, nor did whether the right words would come later. What we had was that now, undeniable, naked, before us, as real as any childhood obligation or adult dream of freedom. We stayed there for an indeterminate amount of time, between kisses, caresses, and words exchanged in whispers. As if the loft were guarding our most intimate secrets, there was no guilt, no shame, only a sense of belonging. August ran his hands over my face, tracing its contours as if memorizing a landscape. I returned the favor with kisses on his shoulders, on his hands, drawing in each touch the discovery of a new universe within the limited space of the barn. Sweat ran down both of our skins, but the warmth of that moment was much more internal, born from the unspoken words and the newfound comfort. When it all ended, we fell to the side of each other, exhausted, but laughing nervously, like two boys who had just created their own world. August's eyes shone, and he turned sideways, his face almost touching mine. We spent time in silence, just listening to the owls and the sounds of the farm outside. I felt light, as if I were breathing for the first time in years without fear. August asked if it was normal. I replied that it had to be, because it had never felt so right. We laughed together. A free, complicit laugh that you only share with someone who understands what no one else sees. There, among the hay, our bodies intertwined, it finally hit me. We had crossed a point of no return, and there was no way to wish for less. The doubts that had previously imprisoned us seemed to have evaporated, replaced by a new, silent courage. August confided that he would never have imagined feeling something similar, especially there, in that worn-out childhood loft. I told him that, for years, I thought I was just running away from the past by returning to the farm, but that I finally realized the true reason. Him. The rest of the night, until sleep came, was dedicated to observing our own silences, our fingers separated by little space, but united by an understanding as old as the place we were in. I woke up with the first rays of morning coming through the cracks in the roof. August was still beside me, his eyes closed, his breathing even. For a moment, I wanted to freeze that scene. Two men in the loft where it all began, with their masks off, free from the silence that had enveloped them for so long. My body still carried the marks of our meeting, the smell of hay, the warmth of his touch, a slight ache in my chest, a mix of euphoria and uncertainty. We stayed there, quiet, as the world outside slowly woke up. Sometimes he'd open his eyes and smile, shyly, as if he wanted to confirm that it was real. Little by little, I began to realize the impact of what we had experienced. It wasn't just a night of desire. Something had changed between us, in the way we saw each other, how we felt in the world. August seemed lighter, his profile relaxed, and I felt a sense of belonging I had never experienced in the big city. We started to talk, at first in whispers, about what would happen now. We laughed when August commented that he never thought he'd need to hide something so beautiful right under my own mother's nose in this house. I said that in Chicago things were easier for those who wanted to reinvent themselves, but that the fear of judgment would always be there, one way or another. Little by little, we started naming our fears. What if they found out? What if we couldn't stay in touch? What if? But none of them seemed truly scary compared to the silent joy of, finally, no longer needing to lie to ourselves. That meeting, more than the act, more than the words, shook everything inside me. It was like I had found an open door to belonging for the first time. August told me he had never felt anything like it with anyone. The arranged dates with girls from the community were nothing more than routines empty of emotion. There, with me that night, he felt his body respond to something new, and that surprise filled him with enthusiasm and peace in almost equal measure. I shared my side of things. All my attempts at a normal life in the big city, the brief encounters without the courage to give my heart away, now seemed like just necessary stages to bring me there, to him. Our conversation was a balance of feelings. We talked about what it would be like to hide this, about how many times we'd seen others change their lives out of fear of facing who they were. For the first time, there was more hope than apprehension in me. I saw the same decision in August's eyes, to prefer a true life, even if a secret one, to a comfortable lie. Before we went downstairs, we agreed to leave something there, in the loft, to symbolize that night. A small piece of wood he had carved with our initials when we were kids. Between smiles and held back tears, we sealed a secret promise there. When we stepped back onto the beaten ground of the farm, we felt the air was different between us. We didn't make anything explicit in our routine. The coffee we drank in silence, the knowing glances in the rare moments we were alone. But we knew that from then on, everything had changed. The world hadn't gotten easier. There were uncertain futures, intimate and external challenges. But the fear was replaced by the lightness of finally being who we were, with all the uncertainty and beauty that comes with it. Time didn't lose its rhythm on the farm, even after that night when everything changed. The smell of fresh hay and the buzzing of bees continued to fill the mornings, as if nothing had happened, but inside me the world had rearranged itself. The following days were a winding exercise in balance. We tried to turn the extraordinary of the loft into a normal part of our daily interactions. The farm routine went on, the chores came in a line, and August and I seemed to dance around the curious looks of our family members, as if our secret were whispering on the old wooden walls. On the first morning after that night, I walked slowly from my room to the farm shed. I carried with me a new lightness and a weight. In August's disguised glances, there was the sparkle of someone who knows. When we passed each other during the cow milking, a distracted touch, an inside joke that only the two of us understood, would slip out. But inside, waves of questions were rising, in me and in him. What did all of this mean? And now, what was next? The fear of what might happen if someone became suspicious, and, at the same time, the desire to fight to preserve what, for so long, had only been a silent fantasy. At night, right after dinner, we went up to the loft together as if we were visiting an altar. We carried our universe's small relics hidden with us. A piece of wood carved with our initials, full of marks made during childhood, and an old iron nail, a silent symbol of the deep connection that now had a new meaning. There in the dark, with our hands held and our hearts racing, we buried our secret symbol in a crack in the floor, protected by the shadows and the dust that covered everything, like a time capsule. The symbolism of this gesture weighed on me. We had the courage to surrender to that feeling, and the clarity that the world wouldn't change because of us. It was in the intimacy, in the strength of our secret, that the promise of a possible life was established, even if, for now, it was a discreet one. August looked at me as if every breath said, "Thank you," not just for what we did, but for the fact that we no longer had to deny our own desires. We stayed there for a while, lying side by side in the hay, exchanging ideas about the future in almost childlike whispers. My return to the city was inevitable, no matter how much everything in me now protested. The last day on the farm took on a bittersweet tone. The gray sky of a late autumn added a sense of longing to the horizon. Mrs. Reed noticed my state of unrest, but she remained absorbed in her kitchen tasks. Maybe routine was a refuge even for those who don't know what lies behind others' silences. Each chore became an excuse to linger by his side, tidying up the stable, sorting seeds, one last look around the crop. We were like two boys trying to grab hold of the hours before saying goodbye. At one point, we sat on the back fence, where only the wind could hear us. August was looking down, without the easy smile of the other days. "So now what, Simon?" The question was heavy, as raw as it was necessary. I didn't have a ready answer, but I didn't want to run away anymore. I said, with the honesty of the first time, that I didn't know how it would be, or if it would be, but I wanted to try anyway. His eyes filled with tears, of fear, of hope, of everything at once. "I've been waiting for this more than I ever realized," he confessed, far from any fear of seeming vulnerable. Deep down, we were two scared men trying to invent a courage we were never given as a gift. Before I left, we agreed on silent rules to preserve what we had won. Not promises of forever, but real agreements. I would stay in touch. Letters hidden among orders for seeds and mundane items. Maybe quick calls on market days in the neighboring village. August, in turn, would try to gain more autonomy within the farm's management so he could, maybe, visit the city without raising suspicion. We discussed, between nervous laughs and intertwined hands, the possibility of a future of small, secret meetings, the possible construction of a shared path, little by little out of the shadows. The goodbye was as simple as it was overwhelming. There were no long speeches or tears in front of others, just an intense hug, the warmth of our bodies remembering everything we had lived with such urgency in just a few days. "I need you to know that that was real for me," he whispered in my ear. I held his face firmly between my hands and replied, "There is no other place I want to be than here, even if only for these brief moments." On the road back to Chicago, images of the farm came back in flashes. The loft, the wet sand of the creek, August's smile at dawn, the shared silences. For the first time, the future wasn't an empty corridor. It was an open field where, even in the face of risks and pain, I could envision a life where I would finally be my own person, no matter how many pieces I had to put together to do it. Days after my return, that whole experience was still reverberating. I felt I couldn't live like before, splitting myself between two worlds, two characters, two kinds of silence. What happened between August and me wasn't just a chance meeting, or just desire. It was belonging, a kind of love that doesn't need to become public to be legitimate, that strengthens in the courage to exist discreetly, and who knows, one day, without fear. I began to realize that the hardest thing, for me, was admitting that happiness can come from the most unlikely places and through the least obvious paths. I thought a lot about how many years I spent wanting to fit in the city, on the farm, among acquaintances, among strangers. It was only there, in his arms, in the lines between the hay and in the silent promise left in the loft, that my pieces finally came together. It's not the world that needs to authorize my happiness. It's me. The urban routine tried to pull me back in. Work meetings, deadlines to meet, accumulated emails. No one in Chicago could imagine what had been transformed inside me in rural Pennsylvania. I started including August in my vacation plans, already calculating the months until my next return. The flame of that night, and the complicit silence of the following days, continued to be my answer to moments of insecurity. August wrote simple but heartfelt letters, which he hid in the shipments of farm products. I replied with photos of small renovations I was doing at home, scribbling notes, telling jokes about the big city. We slowly planned future meetings, always being careful to keep everything under the veil of discretion that life demanded. Even so, with all the distance and all the risks, my life now had a sense of waiting, of a project, a delicate hope. Some nights, sitting at the window of my Chicago apartment, I would close my eyes and smell the hay. I'd mentally revisit the loft, the warmth of his body, the clasp of his hands, all that silent fullness. I finally understood that I didn't need anyone else's approval to live the truth that had been revealed between those old wooden walls. It took years of missed connections and frustrating attempts at self-acceptance until life, in the most unlikely way, brought me a freedom loaded with fear, but also with meaning. The memory of August showed me that those who truly understand us don't need explanations or labels. He taught me that true bonds flourish even in silence, in small gestures, in whispered words, and that fighting for yourself can be silent, but it is never useless or lonely if there is someone there to keep secrets with you. Over time, the secret of the loft became less of a secret and more of a foundation. More than once a year, August would find an excuse to visit the city, and I would take every free day to dive back into the restless life of the farm, where I learned that belonging doesn't depend on a place, but on people. My biggest fear, that I would never be fully understood, began to shrink. The feeling of being at home transferred from geography and rules to inside my chest, where only August and I had access. This story doesn't end. It continues with me, every time someone asks me about my origins, and I smile to myself, knowing where my roots really are. I carry with me the certainty that, yes, I took risks, but taking risks for love, especially a love so rare and clandestine, is the most legitimate of human acts. If you've made it this far and felt, even for an instant, the weight of the courage to be who you are, or the relief of no longer being a prisoner of your own fear, I want to invite you to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. It doesn't matter if your story happens in the silence of a barn, on the busy streets of the city, or in the invisible corridors of your own mind. Every journey to belonging deserves to be celebrated, even if no one but you knows the truth. What I learned from this experience is simple. True happiness requires decision, patience, and most of all, authenticity. If you want to continue following new stories of courage and discovery, stick around. I promise to bring more accounts, both real and fictional, about people who, even between old walls or distant horizons, chose to live their own feelings honestly, because in the end, that's all that matters. What you're hearing here is just the beginning. The complete, unfiltered stories with all the details you can imagine are available now. See the link in the description right now. In the end, if there's one thing I hold on to from that night in the loft, and all the silent consequences that followed, it's this message. Sometimes love arrives without a name, without a manual, and it only asks for a quiet acceptance. And when that happens, I hope you also have the courage to keep your secret symbol, where only what beats inside your chest matters, and nothing else.